All right, welcome to another deep dive.
Yeah.
We're talking about something today that is, well, I mean, it's so fundamental, it's hard to even know where to begin.
Right.
I mean, we're talking about the impact of our social world.
Mm-hmm.
All the different ways that our connections with people, friends, family, classmates, even the broader culture around us
Right.
shape who we are or who we become.
Absolutely.
And we're going really deep on this one, bringing in all sorts of academic research.
Yeah, tons of it.
Looking at peer relationships in childhood and adolescence, the different kinds of friendships we have throughout our lives,
Mm-hmm.
the role of play and leisure,
Yeah.
how our social lives change as we age, and then even zooming out to this big picture of sociocultural influences.
Right. Really trying to get at those underlying forces that are always at work shaping our social development.
Exactly.
Right.
And the goal here, I think, is to come away from this deep dive with a clearer understanding of how these powerful forces operate in our own lives and in the lives of those around us.
Yeah.
So let's start, I guess, at the beginning, right?
Yeah.
Childhood and adolescence, where those early peer relationships
Yeah.
really start to take shape. So when we say peers,
Mm-hmm.
what exactly are we talking about?
Basically, we're talking about individuals who are around the same age or maturity level.
Okay. Makes sense.
And these peer groups serve some really important functions, right? They're like our first real taste of the world outside of our families.
Right.
They provide a kind of feedback on our abilities. Like, you figure out if you're better, worse, or the same as others at certain things.
That whole social comparison thing?
Exactly. And we learn about reciprocity, too, like how to take turns, how to cooperate,
Oh, yeah.
how to, see things from someone else's perspective.
I remember really starting to figure that out, like on the playground, right?
Right.
When you want to join a game, you have to kind of learn the rules, figure out how everyone else is playing.
Exactly. And you realize that other kids have their own interests and perspectives that you have to take into account.
And that can be a good thing, right? I mean, learning to see things from different angles.
Oh, absolutely. But, of course, peer influence can also have its downsides.
Yeah, for sure. Like if your friends are into risky behavior, that can definitely rub off on you.
Mm-hmm. And there's research showing that peers can actually have a bigger impact on things like whether or not a teenager smokes than parents do.
Wow, that's kind of surprising.
Yeah, it's pretty powerful. And the consequences of not fitting in, of being rejected by peers, that can be pretty rough, too.
Yeah.
Leading to feelings of loneliness, hostility, and even potentially increasing the risk of mental health problems or criminal behavior later on.
It's amazing how those early experiences can have such a lasting impact.
It is. Studies have shown that kids who are withdrawn, rejected, or victimized are more likely to struggle with depression as teenagers. And then kids who are more aggressive with their peers, they're at higher risk for things like conduct problems, delinquency, even dropping out of school.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then there's that whole thing, right, about how your friends can sometimes steer you away from what your parents want you to do.
Oh, yeah, that classic teenage rebellion.
Right.
But it's important to remember that not every kid's experience with peers is the same, right?
Of course.
It depends on the type of peer interaction, the kid's developmental stage, and what outcomes we're looking at. And even the term peer group itself is pretty broad. It includes everyone from casual acquaintances to close friends, cliques, and those larger crowds that kind of define high school life.
Right. Yeah.
Now, you might think that the world of teenagers and the world of adults are completely separate, but the research actually shows a lot of connections between those two worlds.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, like parents influence their kids' peer relationships in a lot of ways.
Okay, how so?
Well, think about it. Their decisions about where to live, what school their kid goes to, even who they hang out with themselves, that all shapes who their kid might end up being friends with.
It's like you're setting the stage.
Exactly.
Mm.
And parents can also coach their kids on how to handle social situations. Like there's one study that showed that mothers who talk to their daughters about relational aggression, things like spreading rumors or excluding others, those daughters ended up engaging in less of that behavior.
So parents do have some influence, even if it doesn't always feel like it.
Right. And then the parenting style itself can matter, too.
How so?
Well, like permissive parenting, where parents are very hands-off, that's been linked to weaker peer attachment during adolescence.
Interesting.
But, while parents definitely lay the groundwork, peer relationships also offer some unique learning experiences.
Like what?
Well, think about rough and tumble play, right? That's something that mostly happens between kids. and it teaches them important social skills.
Yeah, totally.
And interactions with peers are often more on an equal footing than interactions with adults, right? It's more about mutual influence.
Makes sense. Although I do remember, even when I was a teenager, when things got really rough, I still turned to my parents for support.
Yeah, that's pretty common. Parents are still a vital source of support, especially during stressful times.
Okay, so we've talked about the general impact of peers, but I imagine the specific context of those interactions matters too, right?
Oh, for sure. Like, talking to someone you barely know is totally different from talking to your best friend.
Yeah.
And then the actual setting, whether it's at school, in the neighborhood, or online, all of those provide different social cues and opportunities.
Right, and we can't forget about individual differences, right?
Definitely.
Yeah.
A kid's personality plays a huge role in how they navigate their social world.
Totally.
Like, a shy kid is going to have different experiences than an outgoing kid. And even things like negative emotionality, being prone to anger, fear, or anxiety, those can make it harder to build positive peer relationships.
Okay, so we've got these individual differences, and then there are also these developmental changes that happen over time.
Right.
Like, how do peer relationships evolve as kids get older?
So around age 3, kids start showing a stronger preference for playing with other kids of the same sex. And that preference actually increases throughout early childhood.
Interesting.
And then as kids get older, they start having more frequent positive and negative interactions with their peers.
Okay.
But the good news is that as they mature, those friendly exchanges become more common than the aggressive ones.
That makes sense. I guess they're learning to, handle conflict a little better.
Right. And, preschoolers are really fascinating to observe, socially speaking.
Oh, yeah?
They're constantly playing together, having conversations, trying out different roles in make-believe. And they're even negotiating rules for their games, which is pretty impressive when you think about it.
It is.
And it's interesting that in early childhood, kids are actually more likely to have friends of different genders and ethnicities than older kids.
Huh. I wouldn't have guessed that.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising. Then, as they enter elementary school, reciprocity becomes a really important part of friendship.
Okay.
Like that give and take, that sense of fairness that becomes crucial. Group play becomes more prevalent, and they really start to cultivate those close friendships.
Right. And they're spending more and more time with their peers, too, right?
Exactly. At age 2, kids are spending about 10% of their time interacting with peers.
Okay.
But by middle and late childhood, that jumps to over 30%.
Wow. That's a huge increase.
Yeah. And the peer group itself starts to expand, too, as kids get involved in more activities and meet more people.
Now, navigating this whole complex social scene must require some pretty sophisticated thinking skills.
Definitely. And that's where social cognition comes in, which is basically how kids think about and understand social situations.
Okay. And our sources mentioned this model developed by a researcher named Dodge.
Right. Kenneth Dodge. He proposed this 6-step model for how kids process social information.
I'm curious, how does that work?
So first, the child pays attention to social cues like facial expressions, body language, tone of voice.
Okay.
Then they try to figure out what those cues mean. What are the other person's intentions? Next, they generate goals for how they want to respond, like do they want to join in, avoid the situation, or something else?
Right.
Then they access their memory for similar situations they've been in before and how they acted then.
Okay, so they're drawing on their past experiences.
Exactly. And then they make a decision about what they're going to do, and finally, they enact that behavior.
That's a pretty complex process when you break it down like that.
It is. And Dodge found that kids who struggle with social interactions, especially aggressive kids, they tend to have some biases in how they interpret social cues.
Like what?
Well, they're more likely to perceive ambiguous actions as hostile.
Oh, so if someone bumps into them accidentally, they might think it was on purpose.
Exactly. And when they're trying to figure out someone's intentions, they tend to react very quickly without really thinking things through.
So it's almost like they're primed to see the worst in others.
Yeah, in a way. And that can obviously lead to a lot of conflict.
It makes sense, though, when you think about it. I mean, we all have those moments where we misinterpret something someone does.
Definitely. But for kids who are already prone to aggression, those misinterpretations can be much more frequent and have more serious consequences.
Now, it's not just about how we think about social situations, right? Our emotions play a huge role, too.
Oh, absolutely. Emotions are like the fuel that drives our social interactions.
Okay.
And kids who are consistently negative, angry, fearful, anxious, they often have a harder time making friends and fitting in.
Yeah, I can imagine that.
Whereas kids who are generally positive and upbeat, tend to be more popular.
Makes sense.
And the ability to regulate your emotions, to control how you feel and express those feelings, that's a really crucial skill for building and maintaining healthy relationships.
I think that's something we all struggle with to some extent.
It is. It's a lifelong process, really.
All right, so we've talked about how kids process social information and the role of emotions, but I'm also curious about how researchers categorize the different ways that kids are viewed by their peers.
Ah, yes, the peer statuses.
Right, like you've got the popular kids, the average kids, the neglected kids.
The rejected kids and the controversial kids.
Right, those are the main categories, right?
Okay.
Can you give us a quick rundown of each one?
Sure. So popular kids are the ones who are frequently nominated as best friends and rarely disliked. They tend to have strong social skills, they're good listeners, they communicate well, they're generally happy and emotionally stable, they're confident but not conceited.
Got it. And then you've got the average kids who are kind of in the middle of the pack.
Exactly. They receive a mix of positive and negative nominations from their peers. Now, neglected kids are interesting because they're not actively disliked. They just don't get chosen as best friends very often.
So they kind of fly under the radar.
Right. And often, these are kids who are shy or withdrawn.
Okay.
There are actually training programs designed to help neglected kids gain more positive attention from their peers.
How do those work?
Well, they teach them how to ask questions, be good listeners, share appropriate information about themselves, and they also learn strategies for joining ongoing group activities.
So they're basically building those social skills.
Exactly. And then we have the rejected kids, who are not only infrequently chosen as best friends, but are actively disliked.
Ouch. That's got to be tough.
It is. And unfortunately, these kids often face more significant adjustment problems.
Yep.
Like, being rejected by peers has been linked to a higher risk of depression during adolescence.
Oh, wow.
And then you have a subset of rejected kids who are also aggressive. And that combination, being rejected and aggressive, is particularly concerning because it's associated with conduct problems and even antisocial behavior.
So it's like a double whammy.
Yeah, pretty much. Although it's important to note that not all rejected kids are aggressive.
Right.
About 10 to 20% are actually shy and withdrawn.
Okay.
And for these kids, training often focuses on helping them better understand other people's intentions and practice more positive social behaviors.
So they're learning how to read social cues more accurately and interact in a way that's more likely to be well received.
Right. And then finally, you have the controversial kids.
These are the ones who are both loved and hated, right?
Exactly. They get nominated frequently as both best friends and as someone who's disliked.
So they're kind of polarizing figures.
Yeah, they evoke strong reactions from their peers, both positive and negative.
Now, we can't talk about peer relations without talking about bullying, right?
Sadly, no. It's a major problem that can have serious consequences for everyone involved.
What are some of the most common forms of bullying?
Well, there's verbal bullying, name-calling, teasing, threats, social exclusion, spreading rumors, leaving someone out on purpose.
Yeah.
Physical bullying, hitting, kicking, shoving.
Right.
And then there's cyberbullying, which has become increasingly prevalent in the digital age.
Yeah, that's a whole other beast.
It is. And boys are more likely to be physically bullied than girls.
Makes sense. So who are the most common targets of bullying overall?
Research shows that boys are more likely to be bullied than girls.
Okay.
And younger middle school students are particularly vulnerable.
Interesting.
These kids often report feeling lonely and having trouble making friends.
It's a vicious cycle, right?
It is. And then kids who engage in bullying are more likely to have lower grades, smoke, and drink.
Wow, so it's not just the victims who are affected.
Right. Bullying has negative consequences for everyone involved.
Now, cyberbullying, that seems particularly insidious because it can follow you everywhere.
Exactly. It's not confined to the schoolyard anymore.
And the research is pretty disturbing, right?
All right. It is. Studies have actually linked cyberbullying to a higher risk of suicidal thoughts than traditional bullying.
Oh, wow.
It can also lead to loneliness, low self-esteem, fewer friendships, and lower popularity.
It's so damaging.
It is, and what's even more concerning is that cyberbullying often happens twice as often as traditional bullying.
Really?
Yeah, and the kids who do it are often the same ones who engage in traditional bullying as well.
So it's not like they're choosing one over the other.
Right. And if you're a victim of both types of bullying, that can lead to even more behavioral problems and lower self-esteem.
It's awful.
Yeah. The most common responses to cyberbullying are things like telling a friend, trying to get revenge, or just ignoring it.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, victims are less likely to use more effective problem-solving strategies and more likely to focus on their negative emotions, which doesn't really help the situation.
So what can we do to address this problem? I mean, what are the underlying factors that contribute to bullying?
Well, one area that researchers have looked at is perspective taking, which is the ability to understand another person's point of view.
Right.
And they've also looked at moral motivation, that sense of right and wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And one study that looked at bully victims, those who both bully and are bullied victims, and pro-social kids, those who are helpful and kind,
Okay.
they found that only the bully victims had real difficulty with perspective taking.
Interesting.
But both the bullies and the bully victims showed a lack of moral motivation.
Huh. So bullies might actually be good at understanding other people's thoughts and feelings.
Yeah, they might have those social skills, but they don't seem to care about the harm they're causing.
So it's not a lack of understanding, it's a lack of empathy.
Exactly. And that ties into this idea of moral disengagement.
That's that.
It's a psychological process where people convince themselves that ethical standards don't apply to them in certain situations.
So they basically give themselves permission to be cruel.
Yeah, in a way.
Okay, so given how harmful bullying is, what can we do to prevent it?
Well, there are a lot of different approaches,
Yeah.
but the research shows that school-based interventions have had mixed results overall.
Okay.
However, there is one program called the Alias Bullying Prevention Program.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, it's been around for a while, and it's designed for kids between the ages of 6 and 15.
Mm-hmm.
And when it's implemented well, it's been shown to reduce bullying by 30 to 70%.
That's significant.
It is. And the program focuses on reducing the opportunities and rewards for bullying behavior, training school staff to recognize and address bullying,
Okay.
and improving peer relations to create a safer school climate.
So it's a multi-pronged approach.
Right. And studies have shown that these whole school interventions, like the Alvius program, are more effective than just classroom curricula or social skills training on their own.
Makes sense. It's got to be a collective effort.
Definitely. And there's also some research on teacher interventions that have been effective.
Like what?
Well, interventions that focus on increasing empathy in the bully and clearly condemning the bullying behavior.
Okay.
Those have been shown to be helpful. But just blaming the bully without trying to understand the underlying issues, that's not very effective.
So it's about addressing the behavior, but also trying to get to the root of the problem.
Exactly.
Now, shifting gears a bit, our sources also talked about how gender influences peer relationships.
Right. Boys and girls often navigate the social world in different ways.
Totally. Like, I remember when I was a kid, the boys were always playing these big, rough games, while the girls were more into, like, talking and hanging out in smaller groups.
Yeah, that's pretty typical. From around age 3, kids start showing a strong preference for playing with peers of the same sex.
Right.
And that preference actually increases between ages 4 and 12.
Okay.
And boys also tend to form larger groups than girls, starting around age 5.
Makes sense.
And within those same-sex groups, the types of interactions are often different.
Right.
Like you said, boys are more into organized games, rough-and-tumble play, competition. They're more likely to show off and take risks.
Yeah. And they're often vying for dominance, too.
Exactly. Whereas girls, they're more likely to engage in what researchers call collaborative discourse.
What does that mean?
It's basically a style of communication where they build on each other's ideas, work towards shared understanding.
So it's less about competition and more about cooperation.
Right.
Okay, so those patterns start early on. How do things change as kids move into adolescence?
Well, peer relationships become even more central during adolescence.
Really?
And gender still plays a big role.
Okay.
Like, girls tend to report stronger peer attachment than boys, especially in terms of trust and communication. And the structure of peer groups changes too.
How so?
Well, in childhood, it's more about informal groups of friends or neighborhood acquaintances.
Okay.
But in adolescence, you start to see these more formal, heterogeneous groups.
Heterogeneous.
Meaning they include both friends and non-friends, and both genders.
Oh, interesting.
And there's a big emphasis on peer group standards, on being part of a particular crowd or clique.
Right. And of course, we can't talk about adolescent peer relationships without talking about social media.
Definitely not. Social media has completely transformed how teens connect with each other.
I feel like it's made everything so much more intense.
It has. Like, the research shows that teens today are spending a significant amount of time interacting with their peers online. And texting has become the main way they communicate.
It's crazy. I remember when texting was just starting to become a thing.
Yeah, things have changed so fast.
They have. And our sources talked about 5 specific ways that social media has transformed these relationships.
Right. So first, it's increased the frequency and immediacy of interactions.
Okay.
Teens can connect with each other instantly and constantly.
Yeah, for better or for worse.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Second, it's amplified experiences and social demands.
What does that mean?
Well, teens are constantly seeking feedback and validation online,
Mm-hmm.
and they feel pressure to keep up with everyone else's social lives.
Right, like they have to document everything they're doing.
Exactly. Third, social media has altered the quality of interaction.
Okay.
Sometimes it leads to less rich emotional support because everything's so superficial online.
Yeah.
But it can also make some teens feel more comfortable communicating because they're not face-to-face.
Makes sense.
Fourth, it's created new avenues for compensatory behaviors.
Compensatory.
Like, if a teen is struggling to connect with peers in person, they might form close online friendships with people who live far away.
Oh, interesting.
And finally, social media has led to entirely new social behaviors.
Like what?
Well, think about things like publicly ranking your top friends on your profile.
Right, that's so weird to me.
It is. It's this whole performative aspect of social media that didn't exist before.
And then there's peer pressure, which has always been a part of adolescence, but I imagine social media has made it even more intense.
It has. Young adolescents are particularly susceptible to peer pressure.
Why is that?
Well, they're still figuring out who they are and where they fit in,
Mhm.
so they look to their peers for guidance. And conformity to antisocial behaviors like stealing or vandalizing often peaks around 8th and 9th grade.
Oh, wow.
And interestingly, American teens are actually more likely to pressure their friends to go against their parents' wishes than teens in some other cultures.
Huh. That's kind of surprising.
It is. And conformity is also higher when teens are feeling uncertain about their social identity or when they're in the presence of someone they perceive as having higher status.
Okay, so the context really matters.
It does. And boys are more likely to be influenced by peer pressure when it comes to sexual behavior.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's what the research shows.
Now, finally, I want to talk about cliques and crowds, those labels that we always hear about when it comes to adolescent peer groups.
Right. So cliques are those smaller, more intimate groups,
Right.
usually made up of 2 to 12 people, average 5 or 6.
Mm-hmm.
They're typically same sex and same age, and they form around shared activities or friendships.
Okay.
Members of cliques spend a lot of time together, share ideas, and develop a strong sense of belonging.
Right. It's like their little inner circle.
Exactly. Now, crowds are different. They're larger, less personal, and more based on reputation.
Okay.
Like the jocks, the brains, the druggies.
Right, those classic high school stereotypes.
Exactly. And people in the same crowd might not actually spend that much time together.
So it's more about how you're perceived by the larger school community.
Right. And interestingly, identifying with certain crowds can actually be linked to different behaviors and even mental health outcomes.
Really?
Yeah. Like one study found that kids who identified with the popular crowd were less likely to have externalizing problems, like aggression,
Oh,
while kids who identified with the nonconformist crowd were more likely to have internalizing problems, like anxiety and depression.
that makes sense.
It does. It shows how these social labels can actually shape our experiences and behaviors.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground with peer relationships.
Yeah.
Now let's move on to friendships, which, while related to peer groups, also have their own unique dynamics.
Right. Friendship is a whole other fascinating area to study.
It is. So what are the core functions that friendships serve?
Well, friendship provides companionship, which is that basic need for connection and belonging. It offers stimulation, exposing us to new ideas and experiences.
Right.
It provides ego support, which is that encouragement and feedback that helps us feel good about ourselves.
Right.
It allows for social comparison, which helps us understand where we stand relative to others.
Makes sense.
And finally, friendship offers affection and intimacy, that close, trusting connection where we can share our deepest thoughts and feelings.
And that last part, that intimacy piece, that doesn't really emerge until adolescence, right?
Right. Younger kids might have close friends, but that deep level of intimacy usually develops later.
Okay. So what are the defining features of friendships during childhood?
Well, childhood friendships are often based on similarity, what researchers call homophily.
Homophily.
Yeah, it's the tendency to be friends with people who are like us.
Okay.
So kids tend to choose friends who are the same age, the same sex, have similar ethnic backgrounds, similar attitudes towards school, aspirations, even achievement levels.
So birds of a feather flock together.
Exactly. But the quality of those friendships matters too.
Right.
Having friends who are socially skilled, supportive, and academically oriented, that can be a real advantage.
Makes sense.
Whereas friendships that are full of conflict, coercion, or just generally low quality, those can actually be harmful.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. There's even a study that found that kids who were aggressive were more likely to be friends with other aggressive kids.
So it's like they reinforce each other's negative behavior.
Right.
Okay, so as kids transition into adolescence and then emerging adulthood, how do their friendships evolve?
Well, in adolescence, there's often a shift from having a lot of friends to having fewer but more intense and intimate friendships.
Okay.
The psychologist Harry Stack Sullivan talked about how the need for intimacy really intensifies in early adolescence.
Mm-hmm.
And he argued that if kids don't develop close friendships during this time, they can end up feeling lonely and inadequate.
That makes sense.
And gender continues to be a factor in adolescent friendships.
Right.
Like, girls' friendships tend to focus more on intimacy and emotional sharing,
Yeah.
while boys' friendships often center more on shared activities and excitement.
So those patterns we saw in childhood kind of carry over.
They do. And there's this interesting phenomenon called co-rumination.
Co-rumination.
Yeah, it's when friends, particularly girls, spend a lot of time talking about their problems.
Oh, I get that.
And research shows that while co-rumination can actually increase friendship quality, it can also increase the risk of depression and anxiety.
Oh, wow. So it's a double-edged sword.
It is, and the characteristics of our friends during adolescence can have a huge impact on our own well-being.
Okay, how so?
Well, positive friendships are linked to lower rates of delinquency, substance abuse, risky sexual behavior, bullying,
Yeah.
and higher levels of achievement and exercise.
So good friends can really help keep you on track.
They can. On the flip side, not having close friends, having friends who are depressed, or experiencing rejection from friends, those can all increase your risk of depression.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And having friends who engage in delinquent behavior can significantly increase your own risk of becoming delinquent.
So the company you keep really does matter.
It does. And even things like smoking and drinking often align with what your best friends are doing.
Wow. Peer pressure is real.
It is. And some teens form friendships with older individuals, which can sometimes be linked to earlier involvement in delinquent behavior or sexual activity.
Yeah.
But it's not always clear whether the older friend is a bad influence or whether the teen was already inclined towards those behaviors.
So the cause and effect is tricky to tease apart.
It is.
Okay, so what about friendships in emerging adulthood, that period between adolescence and full-fledged adulthood?
Well, a lot of the dynamics we see in adolescence continue into emerging adulthood,
Huh.
but the transition to college or starting a career can really shake things up in terms of friendships.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, you might move away from your high school friends, and that can be tough. But research shows that if you maintain communication with those friends, it can actually help to prevent a decline in satisfaction and commitment in those relationships.
So staying in touch is key.
It is.
Okay, so let's talk about adult friendships. What are the defining features there?
Well, adult friendships, like those earlier in life, tend to be based on similarities,
Okay.
like occupation, ethnicity, age, marital status,
Mm-hmm.
income, education level, gender, religious beliefs.
So you're more likely to be friends with people who share your background and values.
Exactly. But there are also some interesting gender differences in how adult friendships are expressed.
Oh, how so?
Well, women tend to have more close friends than men,
Okay.
and their friendships are often more intimate, involving more talking and emotional sharing.
Yeah, that fits with what we've seen earlier.
All right. Male friendships, on the other hand, often revolve around shared activities.
Like what?
Sports, hobbies, things like that.